Hello, and welcome to our online course on Jeremiah. I want to begin with a little reflection. Martin Luther, the German reformer, is said to have once quipped, "The prophets have a queer way of talking, like people who, instead of proceeding in an orderly manner, ramble off from one thing to the next so that you cannot make head or tail of them or see what they're getting at." Now, let me confess that I am giving you this quote secondhand. It's often repeated. I've not been able to locate it in the writings of Luther myself. I found it in the same place where many others have found it, in the writings of one of Germany's most influential Old Testament scholars of the 20th century, Gerhard von Rad. Now, whether it's authentic to Luther or not, it does seem to fit. Luther was committed to the proclamation of the plain gospel. The sin which separates man from God is overcome by the grace of God working through faith. Now, there are, of course, some parts of the prophetic books that do remain accessible. We love reports of angelic visions, exhortations to show love and justice to the poor, and most especially descriptions of the coming Messiah. It's the other stuff we have a problem with. And anyone who has tried to sit down and read straight through the book of Jeremiah soon understands what Luther meant. What are those prophets getting at? When we read the prophets, we are in part accepting an invitation. It's an invitation to wonder. Not just to be perplexed or confused, although that may happen. I mean, we're accepting an invitation to allow ourselves to be filled with wonderment and awe. We're invited to join the prophets in their vision of a reality that is not of this world. Now, I want to invite you to take a moment to look at this image on the screen. This fresco of the prophet Jeremiah was painted by Michelangelo on one of the pendentives of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And if ever there was a prophet overcome with the burden of his mission, it's found in this depiction of Jeremiah. So what do you see? Take a moment and look, and what's this man's story? I'm immediately drawn into the movement of the prophet's body. The huge space occupied by his legs, his torso, almost commands our attention. His huge, great shoulders, they're hunched over. It's like he's carrying a weight. It's left him sore and exhausted. You see how he's leaning forward on his elbow. Now let's look a little more closely at his face. His wrinkles show years of grief. You see how his fingers are mingled in with his beard. I see how his hand is covering over his mouth, and I have to ask, what for? Is he covering his face as a gesture of anguish, depression? Or maybe he's wanting to hide his words, like much in the same way that a child will cover their mouth when they're lying. And maybe he wishes he didn't have to speak his dire words of judgment. But the effort to restrain God's word is filling him with the anguish that causes his shoulders to slump. Michelangelo presents us with a prophet under tremendous burden. Now, Walter Brueggemann, in his highly influential book, The Prophetic Imagination, he wrote, "The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us." Jeremiah was immersed in a culture of idolatry, oppression, and greed. He challenged his audience by confronting them about their sin, but much more than that. He uttered the words of Yahweh as he had received them. And so he confronted the people with an alternative reality. You will be my people, declares Yahweh, and I will be your God. And with that, I am very excited to explore the book of Jeremiah with you. So, just a little bit about myself. My wife and I, we serve with the Assemblies of God in Brussels, Belgium. We work at Continental Theological Seminary, the Bible school there. We have 2 kids, Toby and Savannah, and have been teaching the Old Testament since 2008. Now, we have a couple books in this class. One is a commentary that you'll find in the course material. That's kind of a standard type of textbook that we use in a class like this. You'll have a chance to read not just the introduction, but then as we're moving through the book, you read the relevant commentary portions, help give you some insight, some grounding in the text as you're working through. The second book that we will be reading, excuse me while I reach here, is this one. This is Kathleen O'Connor's Jeremiah, Pain and Promise. This is an exciting book. I've used this a number of times for the course of Jeremiah. It allows us to examine the book from a different angle. So the commentary is sort of a traditional exegetical book. This book is taking a look at the text of Jeremiah through the lens of trauma studies. So what happens when someone or a group of people experiences a trauma, and how does Jeremiah speak in a particular way to that sort of situation? And I think you'll find it really exciting and a great read as we go through the book. In addition to that, you'll find as we move through the course, there'll be a number of extra supplemental course readings. Those will all be linked within the online course material. Okay? Now, I just want to mention, just again, by way of introduction, sort of our primary approach to the book of Jeremiah. And you're probably familiar with this concept, exegesis. It means very simply to draw meaning out of a text. This is our primary approach as we are examining and doing a critical study of the text of Jeremiah. We are attempting to do an exegetical study. Now, you probably have heard some people will draw a distinction between exegesis and eisegesis, just as a way of helping to clarify what it is that we're doing. Exegesis, where this is where you come to a text and you're wanting to draw meaning out from the text. Eisegesis is when you're it's like putting meaning into the text. You're reading into it. Certain perspectives and things. Generally, people don't, eisegesis isn't something you're trying to do. You're trying to accomplish an exegetical reading. So this is just a disciplined approach. It's learning how to ask good questions to understand what's really going on in a text. And we'll have a lot of chance throughout the course to explore, to unpack this idea. The skill of learning to do exegesis will benefit you, not just in this course, but really in most of your life. It's learning how to look at a text, a situation, and understand what's really going on. Really learning how to ask those good questions. The major project of this course, as you're looking through, is the exegetical paper. So if you've never written an exegetical paper, that's totally fine. We're going to walk you through that process. Much of our time together in this course will be focused around that type of approach. Hopefully it'll clarify some confusion that you might have. We are structuring. There's a lot of ways you can structure a paper for an exegesis paper. We are going to be doing it in 5 principal parts, and really the middle 3 there. Those are the primary components of your exegesis paper. you will have, an introduction, your introduction including a thesis statement. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And then the three major parts: contextual analysis, close reading, theology, and then you conclude with an application. So contextual analysis is comprised of two significant components. One is the literary context, and the second is the historical context. So you're going to be selecting a passage for examination from the book of Jeremiah. You'll be looking for a passage of around 5 verses, right around there. You'll have a chance to sort of verify your passage with a professor to make sure that everything that you've selected an appropriate pericope. So then you're going to do your contextual analysis. So literary context. This is going to be something as simple as asking, how does your passage, like the verses you've selected for study, how does it relate to the verses that come before? How does it relate to the verses that come after? How does it sit within the context of the entire book of Jeremiah? So, for instance, you could pick something from chapter 1 that's part of Jeremiah's calling or commissioning. Well, how does that like fit in and like maybe as a sort of programmatic text that we're going to see unfold throughout the rest of Jeremiah's ministry? Or perhaps you pick something from the so-called Book of Consolation or Book of Hope. So these are very powerful chapters of hope for the people during Jeremiah's day. And it sits in contrast to much of the rest of the book of Jeremiah, which is more filled with anguish and despair and judgment. How does that relate? Is that an important part of maybe a corrective to the rest of the book of Jeremiah? There's a lot of ways you can examine this. So you're looking at the literary context. The second thing you're going to be looking at is historical context. So what's going on during the time of Jeremiah? And you can look at what's going on politically. Who's king? Are they a good king? Is this during the time of Josiah? Is this during the time of Zedekiah? They're very different kings. And understanding a little bit about them. What's going on economically? What's going on religiously, what's going on socially. These are the types of questions that you can ask. But then you look at not only what's going on, within those different spheres domestically, but also internationally. Is this during the time of Assyrian domination? Or perhaps is this during the time when Egypt has taken control of the Levant? Or perhaps the time when Babylon has defeated, after the Battle of Carchemish, and Babylon is now in control of this area. Like, what's going on domestically, what's going on internationally, and looking at these different spheres. Now, an exegesis paper is not the same as a history paper. Okay, sometimes I see students get confused on that point. I just want to make sure to clarify the distinction. We're not just after reconstructing the history. We reconstruct the history because what we're after is the meaning in the text. That's the primary goal of exegesis. What does this text mean? And then we look at the next step is how do we then apply it? That's in a nutshell what an exegetical paper is. History is a part of that, but it's not the primary object of our study. So hopefully you'll learn and appreciate the distinction of that as we go through the course. The next part, this is actually probably the biggest part of your paper. It's what's called a close reading, where you're doing a detailed analysis of the verses that you have chosen. So at this point, you've given me the context. You've told me how your verses that you've selected for study, how it fits within the book of Jeremiah as a whole. You've also given me how it fits within the historical context. But now this is the point at which you're going to carefully move verse by verse through the passage that you've selected, appreciating every detail that you can, and kind of breaking those down to how it helps us understand what's going on. This is very similar to what you find in a commentary. Commentaries usually have a significant introduction that sketch out the literary structure of the book, that sketch out the historical context of the book, and then it moves into going verse by verse, sometimes taking 2 or 3 verses, depends on the commentary. Some are very detailed and some are more of a bird's eye view, but you're working through the passages point by point and just appreciating, looking at syntactical features, all these kinds of things. You have an opportunity to do a word study for this book. I think it's a good thing to get a little bit of experience on to understand how that might work. So that's the close reading, and you really should be spending the majority of your time for your exegetical paper at that point, doing that section of the paper. And then the third of the major sections, what's listed number here, is theology. So you've looked at how your passage fits within the book of Jeremiah as a whole. You've looked at how it fits within the historical context. You've done your close verse-by-verse detailed analysis, your close reading, and now you begin to say, okay, what does this mean? What's the theology of this passage? What does this tell us about God? What does this tell us about humanity and how we relate to God, how God views humanity, how God views the actions of humanity? All of that is part of theology. You want to look at both how once you have an idea of what that theology is, you might begin at this point to look a little bit more broadly outside of the book of Jeremiah. You might say, until this point, you kind of want to have blinders on and you're staying laser focused on your text. This is the point where you take the blinders off and you say, okay, I have an appreciation for what this passage means. Are there any other places in the Old Testament that reinforce this idea? Are there any other prophets who perhaps have a similar kind of theology? If Jeremiah is using marriage as a metaphor, are there any other prophets that use marriage as a metaphor to describe, the people of Israel's unfaithfulness to God? Yeah, absolutely. There sure are. This is your chance to examine those. But then also, because we're coming at this text from a Christian's perspective, you can look at, you're bringing in where are these ideas found within the Old Testament, but you also have the opportunity now to say, are there any places where these ideas are found in the New Testament? Okay, and this is your chance to bring that in. You shouldn't really be bringing in much of the perspective of the New Testament until this point, if that makes sense. And then finally, conclude your paper. This is where you get to the application of your passage. The application, for the purposes of this course, you could do a major project on this. This is going to be a fairly minor part of your exegetical paper. If you are so inclined, sort of a traditional application for an exegetical paper is to write a sermon outline. So how would you preach the sermon that you've done your analysis on? And just give an outline of a sermon. You're just kind of wrapping things up, bringing in a conclusion, and just showing in a brief way how your passage can then be applied to a modern context. And if you are so inclined, you can get very specific. If you are interested in a skateboarding ministry and you want to talk about how your passage can be applied in that very specific context, by all means. If you're interested in being a global worker and serving in a country whose culture is very different from Western culture, the United States, that's perfectly fine. You're more than welcome to suggest how your passage applies within those contexts. Okay, so that's the basic idea of exegesis. Again, it's the major approach we're going to be doing as we're working through the book of Jeremiah. Hopefully you will see, you appreciate how exegesis works as an approach to the text, and by all means, be contacting us, be contacting me or whoever is running the course if you have questions about the exegetical paper. Okay, and then finally, I want to direct your attention to an essay that is provided in the course material. This is an essay called "The Student, the Fish, and Agassiz." This is a classic story. It's very readable. It's quite short. It's kind of a parable of exegesis. Okay, it just gives a very good picture of what exegesis really looks like. So you'll find that, read it, enjoy it, and think through what it is, what the story is trying to teach about exegesis. Okay, and again, thank you very much for enrolling in this course, and excited to be looking through the book of Jeremiah with you.